Hi, folks. It's Andy, the analytical preacher. I think most folks are aware there's been a raging debate between atheists who are scientists and Christians who are scientists for some time. And the key word, the key component in that debate between atheists and Christians is not the word God or Big Bang. It's not the word Bible or evolution, but it comes down really to just the word design. If something appears to be well engineered, if something appears designed, does it then necessitate a designer or an engineer? If something appears to be well designed, and it appears to be well designed for a specific purpose, and it appears to be well co-designed to work with other items, does that even more so suggest that there's some creator, designer, or engineer behind that item? This so-called teleological argument for the existence of God is a long-running debate. We're going to talk about 2 or 3 books in this podcast. The first one is from 1802, so it kind of gives you an idea of how long this debate has gone. It would be impossible for me to extensively cover those topics in a podcast, but we can explain the essence of this argument, and we can see the power that this argument of a design requires a designer has. Let me start off with the basic concept, the basic logic that's used here. If you're familiar with Stonehenge, or say the giant stone heads on Easter Island, if you're not familiar with those things, you can go to your favorite search engine and Bing them up or Google them up and quickly see what I'm saying. But if you look at Stonehenge, which is really just a circular collection of these stones that appears to have been stood on their ends, it appears that they were aligned with the summer and winter solstices, and you find them over in Wiltshire, England. If you see Stonehenge, which is just a bunch of, again, stones stood up in a circle. If you see the heads on Easter Island, which are these gigantic stones that have these faces sort of carved into them and set at regular intervals. When you see those things, though we have no idea who put either one of those things in place, do you say, well, I think the odds are just as simple that they sort of automatically came up through random forces of nature? You know, stones are natural, wind blows, rain comes down, you get lightning, you get earthquakes, you get volcanic eruptions. And in the process of those things here, randomly stones got stood on their end and just happened to line up with the summer and winter solstice and Easter Island. It looks like somebody was intentionally carving the face of humans in them, but it's not. Again, it's just the appearance of the effect of rain and wind that gives it the appearance that it was designed. I think almost all of us, if we're honest with ourselves, when we see something as incredibly simple as the Stonehenge stones standing up, we all say, no, somebody put them there for a reason. And in fact, a great deal of research has gone into who put them there and how, and almost no research that I'm aware of has gone into, did the forces of nature just randomly place them there? Probably the most famous argument that's been made along these lines comes from a book, again, in 1802 by a man named William Paley. The title of the book is Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity. And he used a watch. So he says, you're going through the woods, you stumble across a pocket watch, which appears to have gears that finally mesh, and it seems to work in these 12 and 24-hour cycles, which tend to go with night and day, etc. And he says, if you stumble on a watch like this, do you again say, well, it's just metal and glass and aluminum or copper or whatever it is, and so it's just as likely that it just randomly appeared from wind, rain, lightning, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, etc.? Or would you say, no, if I have found a watch, it really necessitates, it forces me to logically conclude that there is a watchmaker? We can do a more modern argument, a more modern example of this, and it could be either way. We could say aliens visit Earth, after humans have gone extinct, or you end up being able to visit a planet that we don't even know exists right now. And when you get to that planet, you see something that looks very much like what we would call an iPhone on the Earth. And you find a couple of these iPhones. There's no evidence of any intelligent life anywhere on the planet at all. In fact, the planet doesn't even look like it could sustain what we call biological life. But you stumble across these two iPhone-looking entities, and you soon see, oh, they have chargers associated with them. And I can plug one end of the charger into the bottom of this iPhone-looking gadget. Oh, and this other end fits perfectly into this, what looks like an outlet. And the outlet is connected to what on Earth we would call a power grid, which is then connected to an individual power plant. And as I study further, I find that these two gadgets can speak to each other through something that we would call Bluetooth maybe, or they actually can bounce off a cell tower. Oh, wow, look, there's this whole existence of cell towers out there, and each cell phone can uniquely communicate with that tower and then with another cell phone through that tower. The tower is also connected to the power plant, but in a radically different way than the phone charger gets plugged into the power grid. If you see something complex like that, if an alien comes to Earth after humans have been extinct for years and there's no sign that we were ever here, and they find iPhones and they find charging cords that plug into outlets, and they come to understand power grids and power stations and cell towers and Bluetooth technology, would those aliens be right to assume, because we see no intelligent life on Earth today, these iPhones are just a natural product of rain splashing against rocks and iron ore and bauxite and all these things being exposed to lightning strikes? Would you think if you went to another planet and found something as complicated as a modern iPhone that we have on Earth, and the way that it connects to power grids and cell phones, would you naturally assume that those things were created by random natural forces? Or would your immediate instinct be, this is too designed, it's too interconnected, it's too functional, this had to have been made on purpose, this must have a creator? I will be perfectly honest with you. If I am on a planet that has never been identified, and I find something that looks very iPhone-like and functions in the way that iPhones do on Earth, I don't care to spend much time trying to understand, how does this iPhone work? How is their electrical grid different than ours on Earth? What I am concerned about is, who put this iPhone here? Who designed and created and built this thing? And I want to go pursue the engineer, the designer, the creator that put it in place, because I would be 100% certain that such a designer exists. Here's the truth. I'll tell you the other side of the debate in just a second. But here's the truth. As we look at the natural world around us, and this is one of the things that Darwin did not have an understanding of, which is fine, because science hadn't progressed that far. But as we look at the world around us, we see literally millions of biological entities, and they're all designed to interlock with one another. So plants can take energy directly from the sun. Herbivores are made to eat plants and take that energy from them. Carnivores are made to eat the herbivores and take energy from them. They're all using oxygen on the planet to adapt, etc. But even the simplest biological entities that we know, an E. coli bacteria, the parasite that causes malaria, are millions and millions of times more complicated than iPhones and cell towers and electric grids and transformers. Millions and millions of times more complicated. So if you look at Stonehenge, if you look at the heads on Easter Island and go, that was clearly put there by somebody for some reason, then you could not look at an iPhone or a pocket watch in the woods or on a foreign planet and say that wasn't put there. You would have to say that also was put there. Now, suppose you find an entity in some forest somewhere, on some planet in outer space somewhere, that's millions of times more complicated and millions of times more interconnected than a modern day iPhone. What would the only natural conclusion you could draw be? That conclusion would be intricate design and interconnectedness begs for a designer. Okay, the atheist answer to this, which is probably best summarized in a book by Richard Dawkins, who's a professor in Great Britain. Richard Dawkins has a book called The Blind Watchmaker, Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design. So he agrees design is a big issue. If things were intentionally designed, then sure, that says there is a designer, and everyone should say to themselves, how much time do I need to spend to figure out who the designer is and what my relationship to the designer is supposed to be? So he agrees design is a big issue. He says evolution, the evidence from evolution reveals that we can actually have a universe that appears to have design that doesn't have design. Now, to get to his book, to get to the premise of his book, we have to overlook some really deeply troubling questions, such as, where did all the matter in the universe come from? The first law of thermodynamics says you can't have matter. Where did all the energy in the universe come from? Where did the energy came from that set off the Big Bang? There is no theory, there is no really scientific possibility for that even happening. How did inorganic matter spring to life? That's a huge issue, really much bigger than the issue that Dawkins deals with in his book. But we're going to look over that. We're going to grant him that, though we probably should not. Maybe an iPhone, if enough wind, if enough rain, if enough minerals and chemicals were all in the same place and the volcanic stuff did just what it needed to do, maybe an iPhone that looks and acts just like our iPhones today could randomly pop into place. You're sitting there shaking your head going, no, it couldn't. Not as intricate and detailed and designed as it is. But okay, say it did. How would it spring to life? How would it come to have a conscience and be able to reproduce itself like biological creatures do? There's simply, science says we do not know how that happened. And every time we think we have a lead on how that happens, we find out, oh yeah, that's definitely not how that happens. So there are massive questions that science would have to answer if it wants to do away with the designer. Where did matter come from? Where did energy come from? What is energy? First of all, how did some of this matter spring to organic, biological life, etc.? But the argument in the book, The Blind Watchmaker, is essentially this, that DNA in the biological entity is akin to software, and that through mutations in the DNA, which can happen when DNA copies itself for reproduction, etc., through random mutations in the DNA, that entities change. And because sometimes the entity changes and immediately it goes away, it dies because the change was very, very bad for that organism. And sometimes the entity changes and the organism does better than its brothers and sisters because it's got a slight advantage somehow in the new environment. And so all of a sudden, it appears to you like that entity was designed to live in this environment, but it actually wasn't. It was just random. There were 5 random mutations. 4 of them died out because they were less likely to survive in the environment. 1 of them thrived and overtook the organism from which it originally came. And it appears now that it was designed for this environment when in fact it was not designed for this environment. And again, there are questions that science needs to answer about where that organic life even came from to begin with. Let's go past that. Here's the biggest problem that most philosophers and Christians see with this argument of the DNA software gives the appearance of design. It is taking the most complicated part in the system, a part that needs explaining itself, and uses the most complicated part of the system to explain apparent design in the less complicated parts of the system. And that just logically, rationally is upside down, inside out, and essentially cannot be allowed in a legitimate argument or in a legitimate debate. So let me give you an example. Let's say that these iPhones that we have found on this planet or whatever, we go and we see, oh, these iPhones that look like they were made, we're looking for the designer because of all the things. Now we found a plant, a manufacturing plant, and it's automated. Software runs computers and robots. And the software tells the computer, send this much sand and this much bauxite and this much copper and combine it in this way through this robotic arm, and then send it down the assembly line where this and this will be added to it, and then shoot it out the back. And so we say there's an electrical storm on planet X or wherever we're at, and it changes that software. And the change makes the iPhone not able to work. Now it won't plug into the adapter and it won't charge, and that all of those iPhones are useless. They go extinct. Lightning hits, another electrical storm, the software in the system changes again. And now all of a sudden, the iPhone has a slight adaptation that actually makes it more rugged. So now it will plug into the charger, it will plug into the electric grid, it can speak to the cell towers, it can use its Bluetooth technology, but now it's just a more durable, stable. And so those type of iPhones now that get spit off the end of the factory floor tend to take over and dominate all the iPhones on the planet because it's just a little bit better. And so you see, Dawkins would say, it looks like these iPhones were designed to fit this rugged environment of Planet X, when really it was just a random change in the software that runs the factory that automatically builds the iPhones. And you scratch your head for a minute, and then you go, wait a minute, where did the factory come from? And who put the software in place to run the computers and run the robots to automatically build the iPhones in the first place? And that is a massive issue. I cannot take a factory, a software-driven, computer-driven, robot-maintained factory that's thousands and thousands of times more complex than an iPhone and use it to explain how the features on the iPhone changed over time. It begs the question, I don't need to understand the simpler iPhone. First, I need to understand the more complicated factory. And there's the problem with trying to refute the design argument. DNA is the most complicated part of any organism living on Earth today. And it's not even close. DNA is the most complicated thing on Earth today. Humans, we have artificial intelligence software, and we can send instant messages all around the world. We've got satellites orbiting the Earth constantly, and that's all incredibly complex stuff. And the DNA in a simple fruit fly is thousands and thousands and thousands of times more complex than any satellite or any artificial intelligence software that will ever be created by man. So you cannot take the most complicated part of the system and say, oh, well, I can explain these less complicated parts if you'll grant me that matter popped into existence, though that's impossible. If you grant me that some inorganic matter came to life, which appears to be impossible because we can't replicate it or figure out how it happened, and you grant me that as part of that inorganic matter coming to life, it has this insanely complicated software in it. Given that software, now a couple of random changes might make this worm look like it was designed to live in harder soil when this worm over here was designed to live in softer soil, just because some software got messed up and the worms were different. It doesn't work that way. In fact, if you're familiar with the book, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Of all three books that I've mentioned today, that would be the one I would say folks should read if you're interested in this topic. The writer is a gentleman named Anthony Flew. He calls himself the world's most notorious atheist. He probably was the world's most notorious atheist. But he says that he always said he would allow data and facts to change his mind. And so in his book, There Is a God, he explains how he came to understand that there is a creator, there is a designer, and it's based literally along this argument right here, that DNA is so complex and it is so clearly designed to do what it does, to run the automated factory of the biological organisms that it inhabits, that it begs an explanation beyond what nature can provide. And that the information contained in DNA, the software that runs the computers and the robots that builds the iPhones, is what needs to be explained. And the clear, obvious, complicated design there says there is a God, period. Now, some atheists lately, because they understand that they're really sort of losing the battle because of the DNA software, you can't use the more complicated parts to explain the less complicated parts. They've begun to say, but there's design in nature that we do see happen naturally. Ice crystals, they say, snowflakes each have a unique design. You know, that's true. A snowflake does have a unique design from the next snowflake, or an ice crystal maybe from the next. But that is a natural process. If I just freeze water, then it forms ice crystals, or if snow falls from the heavens, it has a unique design. But again, it doesn't appear that that was designed for a purpose. It's not designed to interlock with anything else. Those arguments have really been falling on deaf ears. That those are really hollow arguments, that just because each snowflake is unique, it means that there doesn't have to be a God. So I'll go back to my original question and simply challenge you. If you see Stonehenge in England, if you find a pocket watch in a forest where they tell you no human being has ever been, if you find an iPhone-looking gadget complete with all of the functionality on a planet that the scientists swear has never had any intelligent biological life on it, would you assume that those things, Stonehenge, Easter Island, iPhones, stopwatches, pocket watches, would you assume they randomly popped into existence through natural forces? Or would you more logically think, would you really know that there was a designer behind those things? If they appear that engineered, if they are that interconnected, then weren't they done so on purpose? Wasn't there an engineer or a creator who did so? If you say, oh yes, if I see Stonehenge, if I see Easter Island, if I find a pocket watch in the woods, if I find an iPhone on a planet, oh yeah, there's no doubt I would say this was put here by something for a reason. And what I want to know is not how this thing works, but who put it here. Then you would have to logically say, then when I see E. coli and fruit flies, certainly when I see things more complicated than that, like the sun and the moon and gravity and elephants and human beings, then I am forced to say those things clearly appear to be designed and interconnected, and it forces me to acknowledge there must be a grand designer, and what I need to do is seek that grand designer. So if you're interested, again, Anthony Flew's book, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. If you're more comfortable on YouTube watching short videos, there's a mathematics professor at Oxford named John Lennox, and he has a number of different, not only videos about these types of topics, about design and creation and the existence of God, but he also debates individuals like Richard Dawkins, who wrote the book. So you can read Anthony's book, or you can simply go find some John Lennox videos on YouTube that talk about design and universe and God as creator, etc. And any way that you do it, I would just ask us as humans, let's be logically consistent. Let's just say, if I look at this and say, oh no, that clearly was put there by something for some reason, then if you look at something a million times more complicated, just be logically consistent and say, well, then that clearly had to be put there by something more complicated for a purpose as well. And then go seek that grand designer, because that grand designer is the God of the Bible, who desires a personal relationship with you through his son, Jesus Christ, who he sent into the world to show us an example, to give his life as a ransom for us, to pay the debt for our sins, and now calls you to know him in a personal way so that you can ultimately be reconnected into fellowship with the grand designer, with the creator, who again is Yahweh, is the God of the Bible. This is Andy. Thanks for listening.